afternoon. My name is Nathalie Seigneuré. I'm a Senior Scientific Project Manager at IMI, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to this webinar on IMI impact on pediatric medicine. The event is part of the series of live events that IMI is organizing. It's an opportunity to look back at key challenges in a specific area and see how in IMI, through public-private partnership, it's contributing to deliver solutions through dedicated collaborative projects and to see how these solutions have impact on these challenges. Pediatric medicine is, of course, a perfect example where there are many challenges to overcome, but also a great opportunity for collaboration to transform the way that we are developing medicines for children, for the benefit of children. It's also timely to look at the impact of our IMI project in light of the proposal to revise the pediatric legislation, as well as the legislation on rare disease. But let's now meet the speakers for today, and I'm very pleased to welcome Solange Coriol-Roux, who is the Senior Global Policy Director at AstraZeneca. Solange will set up the scene and present the vision for industry to invest in pediatric research through IMI. I don't know if Solange, you want to shake the hand so that everybody can see where you are. And then we will focus on 3 projects, and we will start through the preclinical standpoint. And we are pleased to have Professor Stefan Pfister, the Director of the Preclinical Research Program at the Hope Children's Cancer Center in Heidelberg. Stefan is the coordinator of ITC-CP4, and he will tell us everything about the project and how the results are impacting the way the pediatric oncology drugs are going to be developed. Stefan, I don't know if you want to wave as well so that everybody can see you. We will then move to the clinical phase with Dr. Idrun Hildebrandt, who is the Deputy Project Leader of the Project C4C, Connect for Children. So she is the Pediatric Development Alliance Manager, and Idrun will present to us what really C4C is doing as establishing the Pediatric Clinical Trial Network. We will then hear from Professor Ryan Ostenbrink, pediatrician at the Erasmus MC Sophia Hospital, Children's Hospital, presented EU Pearl. And this project is looking at integrated research platform as a new way as well to conduct clinical trials, especially in pediatric rare disease. And Ryan is leading the work package looking at Neurofibromatosis as an integrated research platform. It will be then the time for the question and answer session. And it will be really an opportunity for all of you to ask questions and to see how to put the question. You have a box which is called question, and this is where you can really type the question. We have already received some of the questions prior to the event when you register, but please feel free to really ask all the questions you have. We have dedicated sufficient time to have a good discussion. We will then close and wrap up the event, and we are really excited to have Klaus Rohl with us, who will give the more parent-patient perspective. And Klaus Rohl is the president of the NF Kinder and presenting the patient voice at the IMI Scientific Committee. There are, of course, other IMI projects that address pediatric challenges, and unfortunately, we couldn't fit all. But I will really invite you to read the page that we have and to read about them in our Impact Series webpage. You may as well wish to consult some previous events that we have done, especially the one on diabetes, where Professor Chantal Mathieu presented in ODIA, which is very relevant in type 1 diabetes in pediatric, as well as the event on patient, where Hélène Brice presented her involvement in the project C4C. Just for you to know as well, this session is recorded, and by the end of the week, all the recording and the presentation will be available on the website. So you can go back and listen and again, look at the slides. But without further ado, I would like to invite now Solange to take us through the challenges. And Solange, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Natalie, and thanks to give me the opportunity to participate today in this discussion, focusing on the impact of IMI on pediatric medicines research. Those who know me know quite well my passion and involvement in pediatrics, and this is really a pleasure and an honor to set up the scene and discuss with colleagues involved in IMI pediatric projects. But why the focus on pediatrics? Next slide, please. So there are many well-known challenges to conducting pediatric clinical trials in children. And as shown on the slide, these occur at different levels. At the concept level, unmet needs, this is an important issue to tackle and quite a challenging one since known to be a moving target. The target population, the pediatric population, is known to be heterogeneous. Children differ dramatically with age and maturity from neonates to adolescents, and this is why, for example, as a challenge, dosing adjustment is required to match these changes. Timing is a well-known issue. When to start developing pediatric strategy for a new medicine. At the content level, standard of cares are known to differ from country to country. Study design, which one to select? Do we have a relevant pediatric specific endpoint? Can we use placebo as a control? Can we use more complex, innovative trial design, decentralized trials, or real-world data? At the operational level, different regulation. Do we have research network infrastructure that are appropriate with the necessary capabilities? And we all know the difficulties to enroll children in trials. And of course, trial retention is another challenge. So all this showing that there was the need to work, more in order to optimize pediatric drug development. And pediatric development is known to involve multiple stakeholders, are shown on the right-hand side of the slide. And this is sometimes an additional challenge as there's a need to manage everyone's expectation. All these contribute to making pediatric studies quite challenging and even more challenging than conducting trials in adults. Next one. These challenges are usually illustrated by the following figures and facts. More than 50% of drugs were known to be used in children and known to be prescribed off-label without adequate data. And it's even worse for neonates. It has been shown in addition, and this has been published, that it can take 15 years to complete a pediatric drug development program, and that there's a lag time of 8 to 9 years between an adult indication and a pediatric indication. And as shown in the graph on the slide, trials are slow to recruit and complete. Next one. So all this is showing that there's value of having IMI public-private partnership. And since its inception in 2008, the IMI has been successful, bringing together all involved in drug development, whether from the private or public sector, in the name of health research and innovation. Within IMI, all involved in drug development are working together as equal partners in areas where there's an unmet medical need or a societal need. As such, IMI is the world's biggest public-private partnership in the life science. IMI, as you know, is funded by the European Commission and the European pharmaceutical industry, represented by FPA, the European Federation of Pharmaceutical Industry and Association. And the goal of IMI is to improve the medicines development process to make it more efficient, to ensure patients throughout Europe gain faster access to better and safer medicines. To this effect, and through multiple projects, IMI facilitate collaboration between the key players involved in health research, including academia, universities, research centers, the pharmaceutical and other industries, small and medium-sized industry, patient organization, and medicines regulators and policy makers. This, of course, creates the opportunity for all to work together in the pre-competitive space and to generate high-quality science data. While the focus is on Europe, the impact is clearly global, since this is also the opportunity to accelerate the development of innovative solutions to the most pressing medical burdens of our time, such as diabetes, antimicrobial resistance, dementia, cancer, or COVID-19 pandemic. Next one. And this is why there's also value to advance pediatric research with a focus on childhood cancer, the need to build clinical trial networks and improve trial design, the need to identify relevant biomarkers and drive personalized medicines, to tackle infectious diseases in children, and to put parents and children at the center of research. So clearly, IMI is pushing the boundaries of science to develop faster, better, and more personalized treatment for childhood illnesses. The impact of the work will be felt by children, their family, and the society at large for decades to come. Next one. This slide is just to show you how IMI portfolio is tackling pediatric research, whether in the preclinical space or in the clinical space. With Connect for Children, C4C, IMI is setting up a sustainable infrastructure for delivering pediatric clinical trials, transforming the way clinical trials will be conducted. And in a moment, as announced by Natalie, my colleague Heidrun will tell you more about C4C. With Stefan, you will hear how ITCCP4 is building a platform to identify promising molecules to fight pediatric cancer. UPearl, while focusing its effort on severe diseases such as neurofibromatosis, is looking at setting up adaptive clinical trial platforms to allow multiple companies to test their candidate drugs simultaneously against a shared placebo group. And Rian will give us more details in a moment as well. Screen4Care, recently launched, will study genetic newborn screening for rare diseases, while RESC-EU is tackling infectious diseases that plague children. Other projects are also quite valuable, with not only a focus on specific conditions such as blood cancer, autism, severe asthma, type 1 diabetes, or pregnancy and lactation, a topic which is this day attracting more and more interest, but also on innovative solutions such as the use of real-world data, artificial intelligence, or complex trial design such as master protocol. All these projects are placing children and their families at the center of research. Next one. So to conclude, a lot has been achieved already through IMI. Now it's the time, and today this discussion could kick off such, a work, which is, to collectively work together and agree collectively where collaborative research could be useful, what could be done next in order to help progress even more pediatric drug development, and of course, optimize children access to transformative medicines. The future of pediatric research depends on concerted action to develop a science-driven research infrastructure, and true engagement with children, young people, and their families. This needs support from all, more and more than ever, including policymakers, regulators, and the broad child health community. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Solange, for having providing this overview. And just to reassure the audience, there is nothing wrong with your computer. The sound that you could hear was coming from some building construction that is in the flat upstairs, Solange. So nothing wrong with the setting. It's just unfortunate. I would like now to move to Stefan to take us through ITCCP4. Stefan, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Natalie, and also Solange for the nice introduction and the invitation to this platform today. It's really an honor and pleasure for me to also present this on behalf of our executive leadership team of ITCCP4, Luis Dancato from Eli Lilly, Gilles Vassal from Gustave Roussy, and Hubert Caron from Roche. I just want to start by explaining the acronym ITCCP4 a little bit, because it's really a mouthful of words. So the two components are ITCC, so the Innovative Therapies for Children with Cancer is an organization, a European organization that runs early phase clinical trials in children across now, I think, 25 countries. And the P4 comes from Pediatric Preclinical Proof of Concept Platform. And what that means is simply to generate and sustain a preclinical filtering platform to prioritize new therapies for children with cancer. And I will show you in a minute why this prioritization is really necessary to occur at a preclinical stage, because fortunately we do not have enough patients in pediatric oncology to run all of the new developments in oncology that are developed for the adult space in clinical trials in children. Next slide, please. For all of you who are not dealing with pediatric cancer at a daily basis, I just felt that I should give you a little bit of an introduction here. So on the one hand, pediatric cancer only comprises about 1% of all cancer diagnoses. However, it's still the #1 cause of death by disease in childhood, adolescence, and also for young adults. However, it's also important to understand that cancers, the spectrum of cancers in children is really fundamentally different to the spectrum in adults. And if you just look at these graphs here, you will realize that pediatric cancers are dominated by acute leukemias, lymphomas, CNS tumors, different soft tissue tumors, sarcomas, and other embryonal tumors, whereas the vast majority of adult cancer is epithelial tumors, which are extremely rare in children, which already tells you that probably it's not always possible to extrapolate from all the discoveries and all the insights that were obtained in adult oncology to pediatrics. One number that is also important to understand is that about 50% of all gained patient years, despite pediatric cancer being so rare, is actually generated in pediatric oncology, because the patients who are surviving for 60, 70, 80 years rather than for another few years as often in the adult space, which also means that we even more closely have to take into account long-term side effects of the treatments that we are giving, because these patients will really have to live with these for many years. Next. The clinical need is probably best reflected by this curve. So there was a dramatic increase in cure rates for pediatric cancer in the second half of the last century, between 20% in the early 70s and approximately 80% cure rates that were achieved by the end of the millennium. But also you can see that this has pretty much plateaued over the past 20 years. So what we think for these 20% of patients who still cannot be cured from their diseases, it will probably need more than just adding more intensive chemo and radiotherapy, but we really need more innovative approaches and also identify these very high-risk patients up front rather than waiting for them to progress on a standard therapy that almost never works and then be surprised that we cannot rescue them at the time of progression or relapse. Next. Another very important factor for us, and this was already mentioned at least quickly, that also the regulatory environment is changing for drug development overall, and this is particularly important for pediatric oncology because the definition of the relevance for pediatrics has been really changed both in the FDA and the IMI regulations from referring to the tumor type that the drug was developed for to the relevance of the mechanism of action. And that's really important to understand. So in other words, if previously a company has developed a drug for lung cancer, they could get a waiver for pediatric development because lung cancer doesn't exist in children. Now, if you would develop an ALK inhibitor, for instance, for lung cancer in adults, and it's known that ALK aberrations are relevant to several pediatric tumor types, the company would have to develop that drug also for pediatric indications. And this is really important because almost all new oncology drugs that are in the pipeline or in the development at companies have to be explored for potential pediatric indications now. Next. And this also comes with a challenge because now all of a sudden, more or less out of the blue, we have hundreds, probably more than 1,000 potential new oncology drugs that in principle all need to be evaluated for their indications in children. Yet, fortunately, as I said, we have relatively few patients who can be treated and who could go on experimental clinical trials. So we basically have to filter this huge number of drugs down to a very much smaller fraction, which then should go on clinical trials and prioritize because there is a good rationale that this works or will work in a fraction of patients. So on the one hand, we need to prioritize preclinically effective treatments to carry on with clinical development in children. We also, and this is kind of ironic, but we also have to help as a community to deprioritize non-effective treatments that we would not want to be blocking the space in pediatric oncology. It will be very important to understand how combinations can work, also new treatments on the backbone, for instance, of standard of care, and obviously identify or validate predictive biomarkers that were probably developed in a completely different biological context in the adult space and then translate that into the childhood setting. Next. For this purpose, we felt that there was a good, this was a good match to the IMI concept of bringing together academic institutions and companies as well as CROs or SMEs to really work together. And the idea of this, and I will go into more detail here, is to set up this preclinical testing platform together, and at the end of the project we'll then have a sustainable platform as a commercial entity that can offer systematic preclinical evaluation of any new drug candidate a company wants to be explored, or it's an academic group wants to be explored in a standardized and industry-grade fashion. Next. So the approach that we are taking here is mostly to take material from patients and transplant this into immunocompromised mice to augment the tissue, the tumor tissue from patients. And once these models called PDX models, patient-derived xenograft models, start to serially grow in mice, we can use them to run preclinical studies very similar to running clinical trials, where we have, let's say, 40 different models of the same tumor type, and then we apply the same treatment regimen, and we would expect something like this waterfall plot that is shown here, that some of these patients, so our patients are mice in this case, will have a good response, and some of them will have a poor response to this treatment. And this will help us to select whether there is a indication at all in pediatrics, or whether there is a subgroup or a certain biomarker that should be enriched for, and then apply this knowledge in the way of clinical trials in patients. And to this end, we are aiming at generating 400 such models across all different disease groups. We have extended this to leukemia and lymphoma last year, and all of these models will be fully molecularly characterized and will be subjected to in vivo treatment with 3 standard of care drugs, one of them being a combination of chemo and radiotherapy, and 6 selected compounds. Next, please. So as I said, this spans all of the relevant organ systems and tumor types in children. We currently have around about 250 models fully molecularly characterized and established. And we also hope to derive organoid models, so in vitro models, from all of these, and also a selection of control tissues for toxicity controls. So this could add a level of in vitro testing first at a very broad scale, and then go into more targeted in vivo testing to identify the best indications. Next. This is just one example here. So as I said, this is done in a single mouse trial fashion. So every model will be subjected to all the different treatment arms. In this case, these 9 arms here, where you have a control. This red encircled dots here, where you see that the tumor keeps growing on this untreated control. Then you have standard of care, where you see quite good responses in this left-hand panel. And then you have some experimental drugs, where in this model you do not see a lot of benefit. And this will be done for 40 different models for all of the different tumor types, for these 9 selected treatment conditions in every case. And then we will derive exactly this kind of pattern to see tumor shrinkage on the treatment, tumor progression on the treatment, and really be able to prioritize the treatments here. And we will also start to combine different treatments where we see some sort of a signal. Next. We also have taken the challenge to put out some recommendations for standards for minimum preclinical testing requirements, which was published as a white paper, a multi-stakeholder paper with industry, with academia, but also with patient representatives. And this will now be submitted to the regulatory authorities. And I'm pretty certain that this will also, to a certain degree, influence how much preclinical testing the companies will have to be asked for in their investigation of the pediatric indications. Next. And finally, we aim at really making this a sustainable platform. So the goal really is to have an infrastructure that will provide the biological and preclinical data to identify and prioritize new oncology drugs for children and adolescents with cancer. And this will involve a legal entity that is jointly run by academia and the CROs. And the CROs will do the actual testing. And we will really try and make this available for both academic as well as industrial users. And we also hope that we will generate enough revenue with this to also attach an R&D part to this, so we can keep developing this further. Next. With this, I would like to just thank everyone. And as you can see, the team is much larger than even these here. It's a great team effort. It has been a great pleasure to working with the colleagues in different companies and different academic institutions. And it was nice to see that actually we now have allies for the pediatric interests in all of these companies. And I just want to mention that our website was just relaunched today, and will be populated with more information, but in case you want to check offline. Thanks a lot for the attention, and hope that we can still have time for some questions in the end.
Thank you very much, Stefan, for having so clearly explained the challenges in pediatric oncology, and as well the work done by ITCCP4 to really get some solutions there and the impact this will have. And we won't take questions now, but we keep that for the question and answer session. But if you have any question to Stefan, you can already start typing them. But I would like now to move to the clinical part, and Idrun, the floor is you with C4C.
Yeah, thank you, Natalie, and thank you for having C4C and me on behalf of my colleagues in this large consortium. So Connect for Children is a consortium. We have 44 beneficiaries from industry and from academia, so 10 of the 10 companies and 34 academic institutions. Really large group of people. Our aim is really to enhance the development of better medicines for children with the development and the implementation of a pan-European clinical trial network. And I think that goes directly to address one of Solange's shortcomings. She mentioned that was, when you remember, currently I think there is more than 60% of clinical studies out of PIPs are not finalized or not started. We don't know exactly, but at least they have a challenge to get finalized. And one of the reasons, beside others, is obviously that Europe is a very heterogeneous country. We have a continent. We have 27 countries with more than 20 languages to be spoken, and healthcare systems, and a very scattered infrastructure. And maybe to the next slide, when we implemented this IMI project, we were of the opinion that something like this can really only be handled through a broad public-private consortia, because one of the aims was really to overcome the fragmented infrastructure we currently have across Europe, with a very heterogeneous past, with countries where literally no pediatric development infrastructure exists, and really look into this from a multidisciplinary angle also. And yeah, to collectively then address really the needs for children. What is the expected impact of building such a network or such an infrastructure? I think we know we have really multifaceted challenges in pediatric development, but beside infrastructure capacity and capabilities, we also see pediatric development plans and pediatric study designs which far from optimal. And that is true for industry and for academic studies. So that is not unique to one sponsor or one type of study, that goes across the board. And so the aim here is, expected impact is here really that we find a way to improve the way development is done for children, both in study designs and also in the way they are conducted. So really more efficient implementation of these clinical trials, also with a view on future data, feasibility, and faster enrollment. We started this project 3 years ago. We have another 3 years to go. And in the middle of this large IMI project where we are today, and I will go in some of these areas in a little bit more detail later, but in summary, we have managed to really set up a network of in more than 21 countries with more than 250 clinical sites at this point in time. We have generated a college of experts. We have a database with more than 300 clinical and methodological experts who can counsel and can advise sponsors and trial teams in the design and to improve conduct of the studies. We have training facilities online which ensure that all our study sites and the staff is properly trained, and we're working on ways to really make data better reusable and standardized in developing data dictionaries. Next slide, please. If we start maybe with the advice, as I said before, implementation and design of clinical studies, but also use of innovative study designs and methodologies in this is an important step to make these studies more feasible. And we have created not only a process, but really established a group or a large college of experts in over 25 expert groups. All these expert groups are work together. They have a structured approach to come together. We work with them both on a scientific perspective, but also to provide really advice to study sponsors, both from industry and from academia. And that is done through the coordination of C4C and through our processes. And that also makes it unique. Besides the advice for single study teams, I think one really important part here is that most of that we have a standalone patient-parent advisory group, a PPI, patient public involvement team, which allows us that we have patient input or patient-parent caregiver input into all of the advices we have, and we have these young people directly involved in all steps of the development. Next slide, please. How is this advice implemented and how is it taken up? I think up to date we have received from consortium partner, both from industry and from academic partners, roughly 29 requests for input and for advice. Roughly a third of them included also requests to have patients directly on the table as part of a larger advisory group with the experts, and we have a number of advices where we had dedicated patient input here. The areas where advice was given is really a broad range of all possible therapeutic areas, which also shows our approach is an indication agnostic approach. We're not focusing only on one therapeutic area, but this network is really to serve pediatric development in general. So we are open for all kind of studies. We currently focus maybe a little bit more on the non-oncology indications, as we have quite well established oncology networks, pediatric oncology networks in Europe, like ITCC, P4, or SIOP and others. So there is something there, and we try to enlarge it to the other indications. What is very good, all our advices will be result in a report, in a structured advice report. And these reports are also written in a way that they can use in communication and discussion with health authorities around the globe. And 5 of the reports we have produced so far were already successfully used in either negotiations for PIPs or for IPSP with the US FDA. Next slide, please. What makes this process so unique and so efficient, you may ask, because yes, we can give advice, but if we work in industry, we also know the biggest hurdle in setting up the advisory panels is the contracting. It can take months to get really 5 experts on the table, because contracting is a real issue. And we currently working through one of our academic beneficiaries, through Redbound in the Netherlands, and we have set up there a centralized contracting structure, meaning we have at the moment with 128 of the 300 experts master consultancy agreement in place, and we have on the other side already with 8 of our 10 beneficiaries master service agreements in place, which allows single contracting. So that means as a company, when I plan an advice request, I cast a work order with the C4C advice secretariat, and I only need 1 contract, and we see it by advice. We currently able to launch advices within 6 to 8 weeks, and that is really very, very good, and that also allows fast input to ongoing regulatory procedures, for example. Next slide, please. If we go a step further, if we then have a very good protocol, we need to implement it. And what you see here is really the backbone of C4C and of the network. We have, in the meanwhile, established 19 national hubs, or you could also say created 19 pediatric national networks in 21 countries. We have Finland and Iceland working together, and we have Norway and Denmark working together. That is why we have more countries than we have national networks. We're currently working with 2 additional countries in the Baltics to establish networks there. And we also included in this infrastructure already, and within C4C, we also work with 8 European multinational specialty networks like Printo, like the CF network, and others. We have in the mix here, and we in close cooperation and in close discussions with 3 global networks, 1 from the US, 1 from Canada, and 1 out of Japan. Next slide, please. Using these networks and the process setting up, I think one of the hurdles of always is feasibility, and also the timing to feasibility. I think, as hopefully I mentioned on the other slide, we have within these 21 countries, we have roughly 250 clinical sites we can reach and we can evaluate and which are connected to us. And doing feasibility across the sites, we have, beside a lot of content-driven challenges in doing feasibility, we again back to the heterogeneous structure in Europe and the issue of contracting CDA casting. And C4C has developed a unique CDA process, a unique CDA cascade and feasibility process, which allows us also here very, very fast feasibility process. The process currently goes in that step that in the first step we have 20 working days after a company tells us what type of studies they want to do. We have roughly 20 working days to get them back a list of all possible sites across Europe. So out of the pool of the 250 sites. In the next step to then go really into detailed feasibility, most companies require a CDA before they really send more detailed information to the site. And with also here again, this cascading process where the sponsor only signs 1 CDA with C4C, and C4C then cascades this down to the national hubs, down to the single sites. We can shorten this. We have for each step roughly a key performance indicator from 72 hours. How that works out, you will see on the following slides. And the third step is then really doing feasibility on a site level and the selection of the sites by the sponsor. Next slide. we have done, or C4C has is working with a range of studies to not only test the network, but also to implement the processes and refine the processes. We had started with 3 academic studies, and we in the meanwhile have onboarded 5 industry studies from 4 different sponsors. With that studies, we now see for the first time on a broader scale the utility of the processes we have generated and we have implemented. And we were really pleased to see that with the feasibility process and the CDA process, we really able to reliable have a fast identification of really a high number of high quality sites. We were able, if you see that, within 20 working days for all the 5 studies we have here from the sponsors to identify far more than 100 sites for that studies. I think in the medium, we roughly have 150 sites we were able to provide to the sponsor, where they could then select the sites they would have a second look on. And for then the second step, the site-specific feasibility, we had the range between 8 and 47 sites which were selected, where we have to say sponsor A here. The C4C sites were an add-on to an already existing running study, so that was an augmentation more or less. The other 2 sites here, that is complete European feasibility for that studies. And here we see that we were able to really do the protocol feasibility with 60 to 70 sites within roughly 2 weeks. So as a maximum, and that is really huge. Next slide, please.
Adrian, I'm afraid we have to speed up because
okay. Yeah, I only have. We can go on here. Next one. Yeah, that confirms just the speed of that process, and so very good major reduction in time and a huge impact here on feasibility processes. Next slide, please. And last but not least, I think that's anyway my last content slide already. We working in a working group here and have generated a pediatric data dictionary which allows harmonization of data. So really trying to generate for pediatrics a standardized way how to code the data in the clinical studies to make them reusable and exchangeable. And where we are really proud of at the moment is that the C4C Pediatric Dictionary was adopted by CDIS, the standardization organization in the US. We all have to use an industry to file our data with regulatory authorities. And CDIS will use our Pediatric Data Dictionary to generate the first therapeutic area user guide. And I think that is a big achievement for a project halfway through. Next slide. And I think with this, that is just a summary of all the key impact points we have, and it's really on design and study planning, on the feasibility process through a great network of sites and hubs, data standardization, education, and I think really our key point is that we have patients and parents and the public in all the steps we have. Next slide. And with that, I thank you to be here, and huge project. We have a lot to talk, so I thank you for the time.
Thank you, Adrian. And indeed, there are so many exciting results that we could have spent more time, but I think it gives a real great overview of what the project is doing. So now I would like to leave the floor to Ryan to get through to guide us through the work on EU Pearl on neurofibromatosis.
Yes, thank you very much, Nathalie, for the introduction. So we can move to the next slide. I'm very happy to introduce to you the project of EU Pearl and the specific actions we performed in the work package 7 on neurofibromatosis, which is particularly linked to the pediatric area of trials. So what's EU Pearl? What's a strategic alliance between the public and private sectors to transform the way how we perform clinical trials, but also to accelerate the drug development process, and of course do it around the patient put in the center. So next slide, please. So EU Pearl will deliver an entity to set up and coordinate an integrated research platform in any disease. But we in particular will focus as an example on 4 diseases: major depressive disorder, tuberculosis, non-alcoholic steatosis, hepatitis, and neurofibromatosis. And in particular, neurofibromatosis has a substantial population below the age of 18. So next slide. I think given the time we can skip this one, so we will go on to the next slide. So let me first shortly introduce what characterizes neurofibromatosis to understand also our actions. So neurofibromatosis contains about 3 major conditions: type 1, type 2, and schwannomatosis, which are all dealing with tumors in the central nerve system and are considered as rare diseases, but as you also see, have a very variable prevalence, ranging from 1 to 3 up to 3,000 up to 1 in 100,000. And in particular, the NF1 has a pediatric presentation with symptoms variable in presenting age and severity. So the next slide, please, which shows a bit the timeline of manifestations from NF1 in childhood and adolescence. So the condition is present from birth on, as it is a genetic disease, but at birth there are in particular skin manifestations present, some congenital bone disorders, and plexiform neurobromas considered as benign tumors. In infancy, also other problems arise, like behavior problems and learning disorders, endocrinologic problems like growth, and in adulthood in particular, it's characterized by the increase of benign tumors, but that may also develop up to malignant tumors, and that's what we want to prevent. The next slide, to give you a little bit an impression of what kind of manifestations we're talking about. So in 20% we will see central nervous system tumors that may either be benign, but due to function loss need also treatment. We have plexiform neurobromas present in about half of all patients in adult age that may be present in all parts of the body, but in particular in the face, but also internally, as you see at the right, with large neurofibromas along the big nerves that may also have a risk to turn into malignancy in about 8 to 13%. It is also considered to be a multi-system disorder, so also bone dysplasia, vascular anomalies, and cardiovascular abnormalities are present. And in general, the risk of malignancy, so any malignancy, is a 5-fold higher than in the normal population. Let's talk shortly on the NF2. So that's the next slide, please. It has a little bit the same disease course, but it occurs a bit later. So although it's also congenital, the manifestations will appear from teenage usually, and progress in particular to older age. They may start with function loss of mononeurons due to the tumors in the central nerve system, and in particular are associated with high morbidity and mortality at adult age. And the next slide shows you some impression of the manifestations present there. So we see vestibular schwannomas in the brain that are almost present in all patients in adulthood, causing problems with hearing and dizziness and balance problems, but also spinal schwannomas and meningiomas, and that may cause function loss, but also pain. Schwannomatosis is so rare, I won't discuss now, and in particular affects more the adult ages. So the next slide, please. So if we consider drug development for pediatric presentations of NF, there are a few challenges. First of all, trials in children need specific adaptations, like Hedron already showed nicely in the actions of C4C, and that's also why we collaborate with them. But also drugs for orphan diseases, apologies for the type error, the drugs for orphan diseases have a low applicability, so it's not the major interest of companies to develop them. On the other hand, we know that there are shelf drugs that may be applicable for rare conditions, and in fact we may consider that it's unethical not to use them to the patients that may benefit from it. And that's where EU Pearl comes in. We think, and next slide please, that developing an integrated research platform with general, it was the previous, thank you, with a general master protocol for trials may fasten this process. And indeed, the next slide. Up to now, we have selected by a Delphi procedure the top priority conditions in NF1, NF2, and schwannomatosis to be attacked primarily for new trials in drugs, as are shown here. And the next slide, please. We also reviewed previous trials in NF, and we derived lessons learned from those trials, and we identified that most trials until now are single-arm, single-country trials, and only focusing on plexiform neurobromas or vestibular schwannomas. But I also showed you that there are other manifestations present, and there are gaps for, in particular, the cutaneous manifestations and the high-grade gliomas, and in particular trials for schwannomatosis. And we hope that drug development in NF may profit from innovative trials on multiple interventions and increased international collaboration. The next slide. So in EU Pearl, we primarily focus in developing in NF1 platform trials for the optic pathway glioma, plexiform neurobromas, cutaneous neurobromas, and low-grade gliomas, but also try to encompass, of course, the other manifestations as well. And for the pediatric field, we in particular focus on pediatric applicable and relevant outcomes and a design adapted to children, regulation adapted to children, but also to develop a network of clinical sites so that we will have access to the pediatric NF patients. The last slide, please. So this shows the benefits and the challenges of the EU Pearl platform trials. We will offer, as we hope from EU Pearl, more efficient testing of drugs and a faster procedure to perform trials and network with higher number of patients and a higher number of trials. But we also need something. We need companies that are going to use our platform, because if we do not have multiple drug compounds needed, what's the reason to develop platform trials? So this is also a call for the companies to step in. And the use of the ERPs, but also the collaboration of the clinical sites and being able to collaborate also within the regulation and the data sharing, etc. And in particular, it's important also to motivate the patients to participate in these innovative designs of trials that are a bit less known until now. So thank you for the attention. The next slide calls for your attention also on our progress in EU Pearl. It shows how you can follow us. And the last slide shows also all our partners within this consortium. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ryan, for showing us what EU Pearl is doing. And there is a lot of interest from all over to see how indeed integrated research platform can really help to and optimize the way we are doing clinical trials. So thank you very much for all of you. I think it's time now to move to the question and answer session. I start seeing some question coming, which is great. Please continue to put your question in the question box. But before we do the question session, we wanted to hear a little bit more from the audience and to understand a little bit more your interest. So we are going to run a quick poll in order to understand a little bit more who is attending this webinar. So the question that you will have to answer to the poll It's about your involvement in pediatric development or in the development of pediatric medicines. If you have not been involved, or if you are as an industry partner, researcher, healthcare professional, patient parent, or as a regulator. Unfortunately, we couldn't put more option, but please, now it's time for you to fill the poll. So just tick in, select one, and we can see a little bit more what's the result. I think we can now have a look at that's very interesting in terms of the results. So many of you have not necessarily been involved, and we do have a number of representatives from our industry sector and a researcher, not so much from the patient and no one from the regulatory, but hopefully they will listen to this webinar afterwards. So thank you for having done this poll. I think this is very interesting and can really see as well in light of the question that we are receiving for the speakers now to address them. So maybe I will start with the first question that we have received that will be directed directly to Idrun. Can non-IMI parties use the advice panel and ask for advice? I'm sure you were expecting this question already. Idrun. Idrun, we cannot hear you. Huh?
No, yeah, double muted, apology. Yes, and I expected the question, and unfortunately, as you know, as a direct advice, we cannot open that at the moment. We're working on due to the IMI rules, so to say, but we're working on ideas and formats how we may make it available even before we then finally end the reach of the IMI funding, but that is definitely too early. We have one format where we can already now accept applications from non-IMI funders, and that is that we organize multi-stakeholder meetings. We had one on IBD, so on inflammatory bowel disease earlier this year, and we're prepping for a second one in the first quarter next year on atopic dermatitis, and their applications from all type of companies or sponsors are open who work in that area, but that is currently the only format where we can allow that.
So the next question we have received is, as was mentioned earlier, the pediatric population for certain diseases such as rare cancer can be small. What are your thoughts and experience in balancing the need for large data set to obtain regulatory approval with the challenges in recruiting enough patients for trials? So I don't know if Stefan, you would like, and Idrun or Ryan to step in on this question, or Solange even. So really the balance.
I can start and try and answer. I think, yes, that is a challenge for all pediatric indications, because I think by definition, all pediatric indications are more or less rare, as we have luckily not so much in children. There is, I think, what doesn't make it easier, but what eases the situation a bit is what we discussed with more innovative trial designs. It's the platform trials on the one hand, but also specific statistical methods which would allow us to use far less patients in the studies than we need for adults, for example. I don't know, Solange or Rian, if you have.
I'm happy to add. Well, I agree with Idrun what she said. So we need to profit from the trial designs and the statistics. But what's also important, that's what we discover building the network, is that we should try to do the same. So the problem currently is that the outcome measures are all a little bit different, and we cannot aggregate the outcomes anyway. So if we would agree upon the major or the main most important outcomes, and also to check with, for example, the IMI or the FDA, if you consider globally, that they agree upon the chosen ones, and we will make sure that we will do the same. That's also a challenge. But I think that's a piece of work that should be done with all those stakeholders, like the companies, the clinicians, to see if it's feasible, the patients to see if that answers their preferences, why they what they experience in their disease, and also from the regulatory part.
And if I may, this is even more important these days, as you know, highlighted by Stefan, knowing that there's a shift, you know, in the mindset, a shift in the drug development program as well, knowing that what, you know, is happening in the US. So meaning that there's more and more, you know, interest in pediatric oncology. Meaning the need to be even more innovative, to even more work together collaboratively, and to look into, you know, what could be done to identify new relevant endpoints, which could help, you know, at least initially shortening, you know, the duration of the trials, and, you know, building on the results to, of course, generate more data to support even more stronger the initial data generated, and to give reassurance on the safe and efficacious use of new products in children in needs. So this is coming and showing that, you know, there's a need to be even more creative, science-driven, using innovative trial design, using innovative also statistical methods. So clearly a lot, you know, is to be in front of us.
Yeah, maybe another an additional aspect to be added from a pediatric oncology perspective is also that we are not always or typically dealing with tumor type specific indications and trials. So I think that increasing the standard, the diagnostic standard of what we are assessing for each patient in terms of the molecular workup at the initial diagnosis and then relapse is also very important to make these feasibility assessments for a certain target to be relevant across pediatric diseases. So I think that there we have the hope that we will have the first ever WHO classification specifically for pediatric tumors published soon. And this will certainly increase the diagnostic standard for pediatric tumors. So it will also be easier and more feasible to assess whether it's at all possible and rational to run a clinical trial on a certain target, even if it was across Europe or transatlantically.
Thank you. Stefan, stay here because there is a question specific to ITCCP4. Is it conceivable that ITCCP4 may be further developed into an avatar approach by comparing tumors of new patients to the existing and stored tumors?
Yeah, that's certainly one of the dream case scenarios that we are thinking of. And to a certain degree, we are doing this now at a smaller scale in different national and international programs, so that we do profiling and also sensitivity testing and comparing to the repertoire of data that we have already. And this is why I was also trying to really highlight that it would be great if we had also a larger R&D package in the sustainability platform to develop these kind of things. This could also extend to more immuno-oncology developments in terms of humanized models or adding other layers of complexity such as pharmacokinetic and dynamic assessments in a preclinical setting and so on. So these are all things that we have in mind, and if any possible, we would love to extend that.
Thank you. Referring to the result of the poll, we received a question earlier on that I think would be quite interesting, because from the poll it seems that quite a lot of attendees have not been involved in pediatric development. And we received a question earlier on about, in your view, what are the most important aspects for a sponsor to consider when embarking on planning a pediatric study? So I think it could be quite relevant to have your thoughts on that. So I don't know who would like to start with.
I can give it a start and a try, and maybe it sounds like an easy answer, but obviously the patient, and that is meant in pediatric studies especially. I think we really have to plan the study around the patient and the family, because everything we do in these studies not only affects the patient but the whole family. That means the study design has to really take into consideration that it has to take the burden to the whole family during the study, because we can have the brightest protocol with the best scientific endpoints. If it is designed in a way that patients cannot really fit that in their daily life or in the life of the children, they go to school maybe or so, then we may not reach feasibility. So for me, the center is here really that we start with the patient in mind and include the patient in all the steps we have here.
Anyone want to jump in or to complement what Heidrun said?
I fully support what Heidrun said. That's for sure. More and more, we have to think of the patient, to have it really at the center of the program, the design of the study. And I'd like, to remind us, of a work that, we did, which was published by the Imprima. I think it was last year or the year before, as a joint effort, meaning we were, all stakeholders included into this work. And we were looking at, what would need to be done in order to be ready to develop a trial which is fit for purpose. So meaning an end-to-end work, having, the end in mind, and knowing that, of course, as we start a trial, we want to have it, complete as appropriate as possible, and of course in a timely fashion. So this is why, this guideline is quite interesting, and summarizing, all the important elements that, sponsors would need to take into account, when planning for a pediatric study.
Ryan, any further thoughts, or Klaus? Or
yeah. Sorry, I was thinking if everything was said or not yet. And well, I think also, well, the problem now is that most sponsor-initiated studies are indeed developed and completely initiated by the sponsor. And on the other hand, we also have discovered that there are some common elements that can be addressed or need to be addressed, but can be done in general. And I think that's also a strength of EUPRO, but also of the other partners that shows their in this presentation, that shows their actions. But we try to make that field easier and faster, and also it's easier to step in, also for the clinical centers to join, but also for the companies.
Yes, I could hear. No, okay. So another question that we received earlier was, what is the percentage today of the new and old medicinal products having been studied in animal models and pediatric populations? So I don't know if that refers specifically to oncology or more general, but I don't know if you have any thoughts of that.
I don't have any precise numbers, but one thing that I can say is that the number of models and the quality of models for pediatric tumors has been very small and very limited, and therefore even without this being the fault of industry, there was never a really rigorous testing possible for the best pediatric indications. And this is also part of the challenge that comes now, that we really have to build this infrastructure and guarantee access to it, because otherwise we can also not blame industry for not doing proper preclinical assessment for pediatric indications.
Yeah. And this is showing how basic research is important, because
Yes.
of course without the full knowledge of the disease, it's of course quite a challenge to figure out what could be done to develop a given product for for a specific disease which is not well known, and for which there is no endpoints that we could be used. So
Yes,
this is an additional challenge, clearly.
No, I can only agree, and maybe with regard to the clinical part, I can only try to come near that when we look in the 10-year report of the Commission for the PIPs, and that is only the studies which have been mandated by the Commission. And I think in that 10-year report we had far over 1,000 PIPs, and if we assume that we have at least one study, or you could maybe say 1.5 studies per PIP or so, then we may have some 1,500 or even more studies which only mandated that doesn't take into account all the studies which are done outside of a PIP, and not all the academic studies we see. So there is a huge need also on patients. We need, if we would calculate it, we need some 100,000 patients every year in a clinical study, and that is one of the reasons of really also needing aligned infrastructure, needing easier trials, maybe needing platform trials where we not need so many patients per indication. And I think that gives you an idea, and that is increasing constantly. I think that has increasing since the beginning of the 2000s or so.
Maybe we go for another question, because obviously there is a lot of interest as well about the pandemic, and what are the learnings from the pandemic in terms, for instance, of rolling data review, decentralized trial, digital endpoint, that you think could be reusable and effective in accelerating pediatric trials? Who wants to take that?
Yeah, I think in the pandemic, from a design perspective, these vaccine trials also in children are quite traditionally designed. So what is really amazing here is the speed and the parallelity of efforts, but also the speed of putting dossiers together and review and parallel efforts and ongoing efforts by the regulators that makes the speed. So when we look to the vaccines, I think where in other areas outside the vaccines, what we see at least in adults and some children is that more technology-driven approaches, like decentralized trials, like remote audits by health authorities, things like that have really increased. And I think at least the technical advances may stay. How much you can translate this updated speed, because that would also require immense capacities. That is the other question.
Okay. Anyone else? Yeah.
The burden of a pandemic is different, unfortunately or fortunately, to a very rare indication in children, and I think that it's hard to argue against that, because there was just a huge societal need and pressure to get these things done quickly and efficiently, and I fear that this will not be easy to translate that into a standard approach for rare pediatric indications, to be honest.
What is quite interesting is to see as well, how regulators are now, ready to collaborate together, and even more, since, the pandemic has, started. So we've seen, a number of important, facts, what, they have been doing together in even, in the pediatric space, knowing that, they've decided, to release information on, this, famous common commentary, meaning providing information on how, to provide information in both the pediatric investigation plan for Europe and the pediatric study plan for the US, and also, working on other topics such as real-world data. And of course, as Heidrun mentioned, we've been confronted, with the need to, not to stop pediatric research, and this is why, there are new remote, I would say, opportunities when performing trials, and this is why there's more and more interest on decentralized trials.
Yeah. A question to Brian now, we believe, is OPG. So we take it that it's for optical path glioma in neurofibromatosis. Can spontaneously go away? Would it be worthwhile? Would it be worthwhile to unravel the molecular background of this?
Yes, well, the OPG, it is indeed the optic pathway gliomas in children is anyway a difficult manifestation to consider for treatment, because we know that a group of it is very benign, but we also know that it's devastating the vision of also a group of patients. So in that sense, it is a difficult entity. Unraveling the process is being done also in several studies, and there is a thought about that perhaps in the initial constitution of the tumor there may be two tumors that look the same at the MRI, but behave different because in the origin they are different, but we are not able to see the differences yet, and that's also the process of identifying biomarkers or any markers we can think of, and indeed I think that condition is a good example of the need of targeted treatments as well, that there is a group of patients perhaps that's is sufficient treated with perhaps low toxicity drugs that control the condition, but there is also a proportion that immediately needs higher toxicity but more aggressive therapy that will be efficient in those other, and in fact there's this description of the differences in such a population calls for a platform trial where patients easily can move from one level to another level when they are in need of treatment. And currently we all put them in the same box for one trial, and we wait a few years with not making progress in that sense. So yeah.
Thank you.
If I may add to this, since this is also
very quick.
Hobbies. So I think on the one hand, one of the challenges here is that still the general practice currently is not to biopsy these tumors, which means that we have a hard time learning about them. And as a positive note, more and more clinical trials are starting to include functional outcomes, even as a first measure, which basically means that we are no longer treating an MRI, but rather really, for instance, visual outcome as a primary success measure. And I think that this will really change the way these diseases are dealt with.
Thank you. I'm afraid we have to stop the question and answer session because we are running out of time now, but we have a couple of questions we haven't been able to address, but we'll see afterwards how we can come back to those who have asked the question with the speakers to make sure that you have an answer to your question. But now I'm really pleased to ask Klaus to give us some thoughts and some perspective on what you have heard and what you would like to see. So Klaus, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Natalie, also for the invitation to speak today. Also, thank you to the speakers for their fantastic presentations, and also to everybody who is attending this meeting and who has an interest in pediatric drug development. I just try to talk about the things that resonated most with me. I think the presentations were very clear, and so I don't have probably too much new to add, but I would like to elaborate on a couple of things. So while the number of pediatric clinical trials in the EU has remarkably increased in the last decade due to the implementation of the pediatric regulation and also incentives aiming to define the need of pediatric drug development, there's still a large gap between the number of pediatric and adult randomized controlled trials. So I'm a caregiver of a child with a rare disease that was also discussed today, neurofibromatosis type 1, which can, as you have seen, cause a large number of symptoms. So that's why it's, of course, so important for me and many other rare diseases that pediatric drugs are developed, and I really call all stakeholders to work together and to solve the challenges that pediatric clinical trials present. There's a high demand on pediatric clinical trials. More than 50% of the drugs used to treat children are off-label with no evidence base. And even more concerning is the situation for children with a rare disease. More than 50% of all rare diseases affect children, and about 95% of rare diseases don't have an approved drug yet. And the impact on the quality of life of these children is immense. So many rare diseases are life-threatening diseases, and action is required now. So we heard about a couple of key factors. So one thing that resonated with me was Stefan when he said pediatric patients are no small adults. I couldn't agree more. They possess a unique and also constantly evolving set of physiological, mental, and metabolic characteristics that require a dedicated exploration to identify their appropriate needs. And as parents of children with potential life-threatening disease, we all desperately want innovative treatments. Since children who are treated successfully will hopefully have the rest of their lives before them, there must be a special focus on long-term effects of treatments. Think about fertility aspects, cognitive aspects, etc. I think also that communication is key. So children need to be involved and informed as well as possible. They already hear and understand so much, and it's just unfair if they are treated as bystanders during conversations when they are actually or should be in the center of the attention. This requires adequate strategies to educate and inform them, but also to receive their feedback and to understand their needs, as well as understanding the caregiver's needs regarding the participation of their children in a clinical trial. Also to understand and have awareness on socio-cultural features or of the geographic areas who are involved, and also good communication with the patients and the families must be really ensured to ensure trial preparedness. Patient involvement was also mentioned today. I think patient or parent involvement cannot be no longer a nice to have. It is a must have. And it also, there's the risk of treating patient involvement as sort of a token, so that it looks very good if it's mentioned in a trial application, but it really must be a central part of the culture of how drugs are being developed, and how this is being developed in terms of a co-design process with patients and patient representatives. Therefore, patients and caregivers need to be involved in the design and the planning of pediatric clinical trials, patient-reported outcomes, patient-relevant outcomes, identify potential burdens to the participation in a clinical trial are all points where patient involvement is essential. We heard a lot about how important it is that there's a harmonization going on, that pediatric clinical trials have a higher efficiency, a higher effectiveness, that the results are comparable. We need to improve the quality of the data and the interoperability, and also reduce the risks of pediatric clinical trials. I think to make the much needed changes in pediatric clinical trial development, all stakeholders need to come together and work together to define common standards, to setting up the necessary infrastructure, building the know-how through educational programs, and also as a co-development process with pediatric patients and caregivers. And I think also in that area, IMI has had some extremely impactful programs like UPATI, Paradigm, Prefer, or also now H2O. So I think over the past years, networks such as C4C or the other projects, IMI projects that we heard about today, have been substantial in the way of improving pediatric clinical trials. By shortening the timeline from early engagement to full expert review, feasible for a pan-European network, pediatric clinical trials become really also more attractive, hopefully, to the industry. And such platforms and their collaborations are essential to achieve substantial improvements in medicine for children in the EU, but also in the US and worldwide. That's what I wanted to share with you. And once again, thank you for the invitation and for your interest in pediatric clinical trials.
Thank you very much, Klaus. And it's a little bit a pity because this topic is so exciting and so much to say that unfortunately we cannot continue. We have to stop here. But I really would like to thank you all for the fantastic presentation and really explaining clearly to the audience what the project are really doing and what will be the impact for all. I would like to thank as well the participants because that's been great to receive so many questions and being so involved in this webinar. And I would like as well to really thank my colleague here in the IMI office from the communication team, and especially Thomas Shannon, that you cannot see, but he's doing all the techniques, and as well my colleague from the operational team, Calliope Christoforidi, I'm doing well, who is really helping as well with tracking all the questions. So we will really make sure that all the questions we have an answer, we can come back to you so that you have the full picture. And please stay tuned because as you see, there are exciting results that will continue to come out. So keep updating, looking at our webpage, looking at the webpage of the project. And again, thank you very much and have a good afternoon. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thanks very much.